Good evening, guys. My name is Ganesh, and we are again back with another session of Azure 104 series, which is Azure Bastion Host. Let's quickly go through the agenda, and then we'll jump into the slides. And for today, we have a very short and simple agenda on Azure Bastion Host, on what is Azure Bastion Host, then what are the benefits of using Azure Bastion Host, and if someone wants to deploy this Azure Bastion host in their subscription, what are the prerequisites? We'll also go through the pricing model, and finally, we'll conclude our session with a demo. So what exactly an Azure Bastion host is? Okay, we all have been working in this IT industry from so many years, and we all know that we have the concept of jump server. So what exactly a jump server is all about? So jump server is basically a hop uh, to connect to our internal resources. So let's say you are a user and you have not been given access to the customer's internal network. Okay. But to connect to this internal network, what a user has to do is a user has to connect to your JumpBox, and then from there onwards, it can connect to the different resources. So this particular piece in the middle is called as a JumpBox. So sometimes this JumpBox also has a public IP address. This JumpBox sometimes also has a public IP address. And when you assign a public IP address to your JumpBox, uh, that specific server is inviting threats. Okay, it is not a secure idea, or it's not a good idea to assign a public IP address to your resources in Azure. When I say resources, I'm talking about resources like virtual machines. Then what is an Azure Bastion host? So Azure Bastion host is a very similar service to a JumpBox or a Jump server. Okay, so let's go through each and every point that we have in our presentation, which will make sense for you when we actually go into the lab. So what is Azure Bastion host? So Azure Bastion host is a secure server that sits between your public internet and your virtual network in which it is provisioned. So when you deploy an Azure Bastion host, it needs to be deployed in a VNet, and especially in a specific subnet. So it sits between your public internet and your VNet. Now, the beauty of Azure Bastion Host is it's a fully managed platform as a service. Now, what does that mean? That means that you do not have to manage the underlying infrastructure and the security. So the security of Azure Bastion Host and the management of Azure Bastion Host is completely done by Microsoft. Then what is Azure Bastion Host? So Azure Bastion Host can be treated as a jump box, as I said, for securely accessing your VMs in your network. So if I want to access this virtual machines in my network, I can log into my jump box and try to access this internal resources. Then what else? So with Azure Bastion Host, you can RDP and you can SSH two virtual machines in your VNet without a public IP address. So now if I want to RDP to any virtual machine in my virtual network, I do not have to assign a public IP address if I have a Bastion host deployed. Okay, so this makes things a lot secure, and without having a public IP address, you can still log into your virtual machines either via uh, your Bastion host doing a RDP or SSH. And then the last point is Azure Bastion Host is a VNet specific service. Now, what does that mean? If you want to deploy Azure Bastion Host for multiple VNets, you have to deploy multiple Bastion hosts for those VNets. You cannot span one Bastion host service across multiple VNets. Now, let me get back to my whiteboard session and explain you how this Bastion host really works, or how a traditional JumpBox operates. Okay, so you have an Azure, and in Azure, let's say you have a VNet. So this is a virtual network. And in this virtual network, you have two subnets. This is subnet 1 and this is subnet 2. What you have done is you have created a virtual machine in this subnet 1 for which you have assigned a public IP address. So what user does is user do not have direct access to the virtual machines which are in subnet 2. So if a user wants to access any virtual machine in subnet 2, they have to first connect to this jump box. So what this user will do is they will MSTSE to that jump box, which has that public IP address. Has that public IP address. And once they are connected to this jump box, they can then RDP or they can SSH to this servers. Now, this actually exposes a risk because this virtual machine, which we are treating it as a jump box, has a public IP address. Now, if a virtual machine has a public IP address, it becomes easier for hackers to do a port scanning and try to identify what that virtual machine IP address could be, because hackers have a lot of different techniques which they can use and try to get the IP address of this resource and then infiltrate into your virtual machine. So what exactly the Bastion host service is? This Bastion host service is, let's say I have a VNet here. So this is my virtual network. And this virtual network has multiple subnets. So this is one of my subnet, and this is my another subnet. Let's assume this subnet as shared services, where you have services like domain controller or DHCP kind of a services. So DHCP is not supported, but I'm just taking it as an example. Or you could take CCM servers or patch management servers like WSUS. This falls under the shared services. And then you have another subnet called as, let's say, app subnet, where your application servers are residing. And here's a user who basically wants to access these services over the internet. So if you want to allow this virtual machines to be accessed over internet, then there are different options. One is you'll have to assign a public IP address to this virtual machine. And then this users can access this virtual machine over a public IP address. Okay. But the problem here, we all know now that if you are accessing a virtual machine with a public IP address, there is always a risk associated with that. Then what is the solution? The solution is, so let me do this undo and let me remove all of this. The solution is you can create one more subnet within this VNet. Okay. So I'm extending this VNet and I'm creating one more subnet. And this subnet will be purely used for your Bastion. So one of our points in the presentation said that Bastion host is a VNet specific service. So if you have to deploy a Bastion, it needs to be deployed in a virtual network, and that too in a dedicated subnet. Okay. So you have to have a Bastion subnet within your VNet. So your service would sit here, the Bastion service, and then you will remove all your public IP addresses from this virtual machines. So now if a user wants to RDP or SSH to this virtual machine, what it will have to do is it will have to first log into the portal of Azure, which is portal.azure.com, and then connect to this virtual machine using this Bastion host. So what is happening is you're not directly connecting to your virtual machine, but rather you're going via this Bastion service. So when you go via Bastion service, the connections are happening over SSL, which is your secure socket layer. So that means you're connecting to these resources securely without having a public IP address. Okay. So what we can do here is I have a few more slides to cover, but since Azure Bastion host takes a few minutes to deploy, I will go ahead and deploy this service and then we can cover this benefits and the prerequisites. So let's first understand the prerequisite section. So whenever you want to deploy this Azure Bastion host service in your subscription, it requires a dedicated subnet. So Azure Bastion host requires a dedicated subnet within your virtual network with a name called as Azure Bastion subnet. So you have to have a subnet within your VNet called as Azure Bastion subnet. And this subnet should be created with CIDR block of /27 or higher. It should be off here. There's a typo, sorry for that. So this subnet should be created with /27 or higher. And then when you're creating Azure Bastion host subnet, you have to make sure that it is not assigned with any NSG. So it is NSG free and it should be UDR free. So UDRs are also not supported for Azure Bastion Host subnet. And then the last one is if a user wants to access any virtual machine using Bastion host, they should also have at least a read access to the Bastion service. I'll talk about this when we actually get into the demo. So with this, we will go ahead and create this Azure Bastion subnet first in one of our virtual network. We'll ensure that we are not assigning any network security group and user defined routes to that specific subnet. And then we will also see this third point when we will be accessing the actual virtual machine. So with this, let me quickly log into my Azure portal, and then we'll see how to deploy Azure Bastion host in our subscription. Now, since it takes a few minutes, we can spend that time on our presentation instead of waiting for the Bastion host service to get deployed. Okay. So why it's taking so much of time to open the Azure portal. Okay, there we go. It is logging in with the cached credentials. So there you go. Here's my account that I'm using it to log into this Azure portal. So the first thing is we have to identify the virtual network. Okay. For now, I'll identify my CT VNet as my virtual network because I have few virtual machines in that. Okay. So if I go to my virtual machines, you can see this is the virtual machine which I already have in a CT VNet. So let's go to that virtual network called as CT VNet and first create a subnet called as Azure Bastion subnet. Okay, if you look at the subnets, I do have other subnets, but for Bastion to be deployed, we need a special subnet with the name called as Azure Bastion subnet. And this has to be minimum with /27 or higher. So when I say higher, it means /26 to /25. So this is the name of the subnet which I have assigned, Azure Bastion subnet. This is the IP address range which I'm assigning to the Bastion subnet. And you can see I'm not assigning any network security group, and I'm not also assigning any route table. So let's click on OK, which will create a Bastion subnet for us in our virtual network. Now we can go to our Bastion service to deploy the Bastion host. So we can navigate to search and type in Bastions, and it will navigate to the Bastion's blade. Let's click on Add now and start the deployment process of Bastion. So we will require a resource group. So I'm selecting ARM test as a resource group. The name of my Bastion. So I'll say Bastion host hyphen CT, or let's be Bastion host. And then I want this deployed to be in my virtual network. So my virtual network is in East US2. So I have to also specify the Bastion host region as East US2. And then it is asking us which virtual network you want to use for deploying this Bastion host. So I want to use CT VNet because that's where I had created this Azure Bastion subnet. And you can see it has smartly picked the Azure Bastion subnet. And then your Azure Bastion service requires a public IP address. Since it's a PaaS service, it requires a public IP address. I would assign this public IP address called as Bastion host -PIP. -PIP. And you will see the assignment always has to be static for your Bastion host. So let's click on review and create, and then hit create. And we'll go back to our presentation to cover the other slides that we have in the presentation. So we understood what a Bastion host service is in Azure. So Azure Bastion host service in Azure is like a JumpBox, which we will use to connect to our internal network. Okay. Now going back to the other slide, what are the benefits of using Azure Bastion host? The first benefit is you don't need a public IP address to RDP or SSH to virtual machine. So strictly no public IP address for your virtual machines. Okay. Then you can securely RDP and SSH access to virtual machines over HTTPS. So what does that mean? When you try to connect to your virtual machine using Azure Bastion host, the connection happens over HTTPS. And whenever you're trying to connect to your virtual machine using Bastion host, no other port is allowed except your RDP and SSH. This is one of the benefits of using Azure Bastion Host. Then, if you want to access virtual machines using Azure Bastion Host, you don't need any thick client. So if you want to access a virtual machine in Azure portal via Bastion Host, you don't require any thick client like your remote desktop connection or kind of a putty, okay, to do an SSH. You can directly log into your Azure portal and we can access those virtual machines using Azure portal itself. Then if you're using Azure Bastion Host, it also supports concurrent connection. So to a single virtual machine, multiple users can connect via your Bastion. Okay, so user one can connect to the same virtual machine. User two can connect to the same virtual machine using Bastion Host. So one of the other benefits is it can support concurrent connections. Then the next point is VMs can be accessed either using a local administrator credential, or you can also access the virtual machines via Bastion Host using your domain credentials as well. So assume that you have a virtual machine which is domain joined and you want to access that virtual machine using a domain account, but via Azure Bastion Host. So yes, it does support the domain credentials, but for the domain credentials, you have to log in using your user principal name. Now, what is a user principal name? So in our enterprises, we usually log in via a domain name / the username, right? So if your domain name is like something like big basket, and so S, and your username, let's say Ganesh. So you'll always use your domain name first / your username. But with Azure Bastion Host, if you have to log in with your domain credentials, you have to use your UPN. And the example of UPN is, this is my username @ my domain name. So Ganesh Sadhav @ cloudtravelers.co.in is my UPN. So you have to use UPN instead of the traditional way of logging in, like a domain name / a username. And the last benefit of using Azure Bastion Host is it literally takes few clicks to deploy the service. Now we deployed the service in our Azure portal. It only asked us for the name of the Bastion host and the public IP address name and the virtual network name. So within the 3 clicks, we were able to deploy this Azure Bastion host service. Okay, let's revisit our Azure portal to see if it has been deployed. No, so the deployment is underway. I still have a couple of slides to cover. So we have already seen the prerequisite. It requires a dedicated subnet called as Azure Bastion host in your virtual network with /27 or higher CIDR block. Okay, then your Azure Bastion host subnet should be NSG free and UDR free. That means no NSG or no UDR should be associated with your Bastion host subnet. Okay. What about Azure Bastion host pricing? So if you're using Azure Bastion host for your virtual network or for your virtual machines in Azure, so this is a snapshot taken from the pricing page of Azure. Okay, so if you go to the pricing page of Azure, you'll find the same thing that I'm showing over here in the presentation. So I have taken an estimate of Azure Bastion host, let's say, which will be deployed in East US 2. And if I'm running this Azure Bastion host for around 730 hours, which is roughly 31 days, the per month billing would be around $140. Okay, which is not bad. So $140 is like it's equivalent to a simple basic virtual machine in Azure. Okay, it's like a basic virtual machine pricing for Azure for a month. So not bad. Pricing is also competitive. So if anyone wants to use Azure Bastion host in their subscription for securely allowing access to their virtual machines, then this seems to be a perfect deal of deploying Azure Bastion host without a public IP address. Okay, perfect. And then let's see the sample architecture of Azure Bastion host, how it really works. So this on the right hand side, the dotted boundary is nothing but it's your virtual network. Okay, and in that specific virtual network, you have 2 different subnets. You have a subnet called as Azure Bastion subnet, and then you have another subnet in which you have all your target virtual machines. Okay, we can call this as an app subnet as well. So let's assume this as an app subnet. Now, assuming that you are sitting on the internet, okay, you are a user who is sitting on the internet and you want to access this virtual machines via your Bastion host, okay? So the first step is to log into your Azure portal. Now, when you log into your Azure portal, this is the first step. You will log into your Azure portal over TLS, which is the transport layer security, using your SSL, okay, which you'll access your Azure portal. Second is, now the second thing is you will connect to your Azure virtual machines via Azure Bastion. So again, this connection happens over TLS using 443. So it uses the SSL. And when you connect to your Azure virtual machine, it again does an RDP connection. So now what you're doing is from Azure portal, you're connecting to Azure Bastion host over SSL. And then Azure Bastion host is allowing access to your virtual machine over RDP port or over SSH port. So in short, it is like RDP over HTTPS kind of a thing, or SSH over HTTPS, which means you don't need any public IP address assigned to your virtual machines, and you can securely access your virtual machines using this Azure Bastion, which is sitting in this Azure Bastion subnet, and which is a completely fast service, completely Microsoft managed service. Okay. Any questions, guys, in the slides that we have covered so far?
No questions, sir.
No questions, sir.
Perfect. So let's go to our Azure portal, and we are on time. It says your deployment is complete. Okay. So let's go to the Bastion service and see if our Bastion host is deployed. And there you go. You have this Bastion host deployed in a resource group called as ARM test. If you open up this Bastion host, you would see it has a public DNS name assigned to it. It has a public IP address. So if you click on this public IP address, you will be able to see the public IP address of your Bastion host. And if you go to the sessions, you won't find any sessions at this moment. Okay, so there's nothing much in the Bastion host service. So let's go to our Azure virtual machines now. And I'll try to start this virtual machine, which is in that specific VNet, CT VNet. Let's click on start, and it does have a public IP address. Okay. Now to demonstrate, I'll remove this public IP address from this virtual machine and show how you can access your virtual machines using Bastion host. So the way you can remove this public IP address is you can just click on this public IP address, go to the overview, and you will have an option called as disassociate. So click on disassociate and click on yes, which will remove the public IP address from that specific virtual machine. So if I can get back to my virtual machine, it's in the process of removing this public IP address. And now you can see this virtual machine do not have any public IP address associated. So if I want to access this virtual machine over internet, there is no way. I cannot access this resource over internet with a private IP address. Okay, the only way you can connect to your virtual machine using private IP addresses if you have a site-to-site connectivity, or if you have a point-to-site connectivity, then only you will be able to access. So if I do an MSTSE, you should see that I won't be able to even get a prompt to log in. So I'll copy this and try to access this, try to hit connect, and you can see there is no way. Okay. Now there is one way through which you can access this virtual machine without a public IP address is if you're using Azure Firewall. So if you're using an Azure Firewall, you can create a NAT rule to your firewall's public IP address, map it to a port, and then you can access this virtual machine via your Azure Firewall's NATed public IP address. But since we're not using any Azure Firewall here, the only option that I can think of here is the Bastion host. Now, we don't have a public IP address. Now, if I want to connect to this virtual machine using Bastion host, what I need to do is, so let me walk you through the steps, what we have done so far. So we as the user have just connected to our Azure portal. Okay. Now I will be connecting to this virtual machine via this Azure Bastion host. So what I need to do is I need to click on connect, and then you'll find this option called as RDP, SSH, and Bastion. I'll click on this Bastion. and it is now asking me to enter the username and password. So here I will enter my username, which is my Azure admin, then my password. One more important thing, if you click on connect, it actually opens up in a new window. So if you have pop-ups disabled, you have to enable the pop-ups to ensure that the connection is open in a new tab. Okay, let's click on connect and you will see it will do an HTTPS connection now to access that RDP session. This is the DNS name of that Bastion host. And you can see it is connecting over HTTPS. So connection is secure. And one of the benefits that we saw in our presentation that if you want to connect to a virtual machine via Bastion host, you do not require any client like your remote desktop connection or PuTTY to SSH. And you can see we are now logged in to our virtual machine using a Bastion host. So you can perform whatever operations you want to perform, and then you can sign out. Once you sign out, you will be logged off from your Bastion host as well. Okay, so there you go. So this is my domain controller. You can access all your services within that server. So let me open my dsa.msc. I can open my PowerShell and perform anything that I want to perform. Okay, so let's open my PowerShell. And there you go. We are connected to our Active Directory users and computers. If I want to create any new user, I can do that. Let's go to the test OU and try to create a new user here. New user, let's say Bastion test. See, Bastion test 1. Let's select the UPN, the domain suffix. I'll enter the password. I'll remove this user cannot change password. I'll click on next, finish. Once you're done with your operations, you can always sign out. So here I can do all my PowerShell related activities. Let's say get -AD user, the one that we just created. Let's try to get that user identity. What was that? So Bastion, what was the user account? Bastion test 1, Bastion test 1. You can see I can get the user details as well. Okay. So once you're done with your work, you can always right click on your start and click on sign out. Okay. But one more thing I want to show you here, you have one more toggle button, or I would say there's an additional button. If you want to do a full screen, you can just click on the full screen and your browser will allow you to access your session in a full screen mode. Okay, just like your other RDP client allows you to do that. Okay, if you want to again exit from the full screen, you can just click on that and click on full screen. If you're copying anything, let me minimize this presentation. If you're copying any, let's say if you're copying any content, let's say I open up a notepad and type in, my name is Ganesh. And if I copy this should show up on your Bastion host clipboard. So you can see my name is Ganesh has popped up here. Let's make some change. My name is Ganesh Zado. Okay. And if I copy this, you can see that will automatically pop up here. Let me minimize this. No. So let's do something else. My name is Ganesh Sunil Zado. And I'll copy this. It should automatically show up in your board as well. Let's try to paste it in one of our notepad to see if it has captured in the Bastion clipboard. If I go to edit and paste, no, it has not done that. I click copy, and now let's try to do this. Okay, you can see here, it has appeared on your clipboard. Now, if you want to paste it here, You can again go back here. Let's copy this and you can paste it here. Mhm. So copy, and it's not allowing to paste the content. It should allow. And strange. Okay. I think we'll have to go to the documentation and see if there have been any restrictions on copying pasting, because one of the restrictions that I'm aware of is that you cannot copy paste the files. Okay, if you go to any documents, if I want to copy this file from my local machine to the Bastion session, I won't be able to do that. Okay, so if I go to my browser, my file explorer, and try to paste this over here, I won't be able to do that. But it allows normal copy paste operation, and I'm not sure why it is not allowing us. Uh, let's try to do it one more time. Let's close this and try to copy some other text. Azure rocks. Okay, and let's copy this. So when I copied this, it should come up in the Bastion host clipboard, and then let's try to paste it over here, and it's not working. So let's do a copy here and let's try to paste here. So it's not working. Let's paste it over here. Let's try to copy again. So something's wrong, it seems. Let's try to copy from the Bastion host to our local machine. Let's open Notepad and type in something like my name is Ganesh. And let's try to copy. If we copy this, it should be in the Bastion host. And then if I go to my local machine, okay. So copy and paste is working from the Bastion session to your local machine, but I'm not sure why it's not working from my local machine to. So let's see. Azure Rocks copy. Let's go over here. You can see Azure Rocks is here. And then if I try to paste here, no, I'm not able to paste anything. If I copy this over here, it's not able to paste here as well. Okay, so we'll go through the documentation to see if there are any restrictions in doing a copy paste. Okay, so let's go to google.com and Azure Bastion host features. Okay, if I open this, we may see some information under the FAQ section. So let's go to the documentation. Connecting your virtual machines, key features, FAQ, and then key features. Okay, these are the key features. File copy. Okay, so you can see what features are supported in RDP session. At this time, only text copy paste is supported, which is not working in our case. There might be some glitch. Okay, it's absolutely fine. But features like file copy is still not supported. Okay, feel free to share your feedback. So there might be some problem doing a copy paste, but it does support copy paste because I have done this many times in the past. And that is fine. You may try it in your labs to see if that allows. But yes, uh, this is how you can connect to your virtual machine using a Bastion host. Now let me show you one more use case. Let's try to. So I have created an account in my Azure Active Directory. So let me go to my Azure Active Directory and show you something that we want to see with the Bastion host. Okay. In the users, I've created an account called as test user one. You can see there's an account called as test user one for which I have assigned access to this resource group. Okay. I have granted that test user one access to a resource group in which my CTDC virtual machine, CTDC1 virtual machine is residing. So if I go to the resource group of this virtual machine and to the access control and to the role assignment, under contributor, I think, no. So under virtual machine contributor, I have made this user as a virtual machine contributor so that he can access that virtual machine. Okay. But one more thing that I also wanted to show you, and we have deployed our Bastion host service in a different resource group. Okay. So if a user has not been granted access to this ARM test resource group as well, he won't be able to access. Right now, you can see that this user also has contributor access, I think. So you can see this user also has a contributor access to the resource group in which we have deployed this Bastion host service. Now let's see the user experience from the test user one perspective. So I'll open my Edge browser and try to log into my portal.azure.com using that test user one account and see if that user also able to access our server using the Bastion host. So we already have one session here for CTDC1, and we will also see if that user gets access to that specific server using the RDP over Bastion host. Okay, let me just open up my dsa.msc to see if we have any account that we can allow access to that specific user. Or let's go to the administrator group and see if you have any specific accounts. So I click on and let's try to find the group administrator, and there we go. Okay, so we have this account called as Bastion host. What is the username? The username is Bastion test. So let's try to log in with this account. And as I said, whenever you want to log into a virtual machine using a domain account, you have to use a user principal name. So for this specific user, the user principal name would be bastiontest@cloudtravelers.co.in. Okay, so let me log into this user test user one @cloudtravelers.co.in. And I'll enter the password. There we go. Now this specific user had access on both the resource group. Okay, the resource group in which your virtual machine is residing and the resource group in which your Bastion host is residing. So if I go to the virtual machines, this user will be only able to see one virtual machine because he did not have access to the other resource group. And if I click on connect, click on Bastion, he would be able to connect to the virtual machine using Bastion. So what is the username of the account? It is Bastion test. It is Bastion test @cloudtravelers.co.in, and I'll have to enter the password here. And when you hit connect, it will open. So you can see here it says the pop-ups are blocked. So you have to allow the pop-ups. Let's click on done and let's hit connect once again. And now this will initiate another session using a domain account. There you go. Now this user is connected to the same domain controller using a domain account. If I see the connected sessions using taskbar, more details, and if I go to users, you'll see there are two users which are connected to this server, Azure admin and Bastion test. And both are connected using what? Both are connected using Bastion host without using a public IP address. And now if you go to the Bastion service, if you go to the Bastion service and go to the sessions, you should see both the sessions are showing up here. So if you want to see the number of sessions that have connected to a virtual machine using Bastion host, you can go to the Bastion host and click on sessions, and you should see the username, the target IP address. Okay, in our case, we are connected to the same server with different credentials. Okay, IP address and what protocol it is using. So if you are doing a SSH session to one of a Linux machine, it will be shown up as an SSH. Okay, so that was all about Bastion host, guys. This is one of the one of the cool services of Azure, which allows customers to allow access to their virtual machines using Bastion host without assigning any public IP address to your virtual machine. So it's very simple to deploy. It's very easy to use as well. You don't need any thick client. You don't need any putty to connect to your virtual machine. You don't even need a public IP address. This is a very secure service, I would say, and you should be able to connect to your resources within the same VNet. Now, one of the another benefit is we only had one virtual machine in that specific VNet. But if you have, let's say, multiple subnets, and if you have multiple virtual machines in your VNet, you can use the same Azure Bastion host to connect to those virtual machine. Okay, so it is VNet specific. So all the virtual machines in that specific VNet can use the same Azure Bastion host to RDP or to SSH. Okay, but if you're talking about some different VNet, so if you talk about PS Core VNet, I cannot use the Bastion host which is deployed in CT VNet to RDP into this virtual machine because this virtual machine is residing in a different VNet and this virtual machine is residing in a different VNet. So that's what all about Azure Bastion host. Any questions for me, guys?
No
No,
questions,
sir.
sir. Well understood.
All right. So I hope today's session was useful and you'll take a benefit of this session by making your hands dirty on this specific topic by practically implementing this in your test subscription and see how the Bastion host service really works for your virtual machine. Okay. With this, I would like to conclude our today's session. Thank you very much, guys, for joining our today's session. Have a great day ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.